This video is for all of you out there who are interested in medical school, whether you're a pre-med or you know one, or you're just someone who wants to learn about medicine and what it's all about. This video is for you. Hey everyone, my name is Rushil and I'm a first-year medical student at the University of Toronto. Today I'm going to be going over every single question possible about getting into medical school and how exactly I achieved that. This video is going to be including every single common question that I get, including what my GPA was, what my MCAT score was, and tips on how to succeed in writing your medical school applications. Without further ado, let's get right into the video. So the first question I get asked pretty often is pretty typical. Why do I choose to be a doctor? Why did I choose to get involved in this profession? Now, your motivation is really important because this is what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life, and people's lives are going to be in your hands. So your motivation is really important. This is also an interview question, but don't worry, I won't be answering it like it is one. So from when I was a child, I was really exposed to the healthcare field through my mother and through other family members, but no one in my family was a doctor. This was mainly through the patient side. And from there, I got to experience how doctors treat their patients and how doctors are truly committed to saving the lives of others. As I grew older, I realized that being a doctor was more than just saving lives. You really get to embark on this journey where you get to learn about the human body in so much detail. And I was a very curious student. I asked a lot of questions, especially about biology and how we work. So that's what really made me interested in the knowledge behind becoming a doctor. So the first set of questions I have are going to revolve around my university experience. The first question I get asked pretty often is, where did I go for university? Of course, you guys are curious. I went to the University of Toronto Scarborough for my 4 years of undergrad. Why did I choose my university? This is very important. You want to choose the right university for you. But for me, I prioritized living close to home and staying with my friends. So this is why U of T Scarborough really appealed to me. Very close to my home, it's about a 20-minute drive, and a lot of my friends were going there. So I was able to establish a very strong support system right off the bat, which I felt was very important for my academic success. Also, U of T Scarborough does have a reputation. It's known for offering many opportunities related to research and extracurriculars, which I knew were important for med school. How was my university experience? Well, first year was great. The adjustment period wasn't too bad for me. I was able to do well academically in all of my university courses, but halfway through first year, that's when COVID hit. And man, those were some terrible times. Social isolation was definitely frustrating because I couldn't see my friends, I couldn't see other members of my family. And on top of that, we were learning in this virtual environment. I was sitting on my screen, watching my screen for like 5 to 6 hours a day, and it was so frustrating. Academically speaking, my grades were fine, so there was nothing to worry about there. When it came to extracurriculars, I was able to establish certain extracurriculars that I could work on, which I'll talk about later, so that was fine too. But in fourth year, that's when the restrictions started coming off, and that's when we could finally go back to university in person, and that was so exciting. I got to make so many new friends and so many new memories that I would say that fourth year was probably one of my best years of university. How did I study for final exams? For me, I focus on consistency and making sure I did work every single day, whether that be simply going through a lecture or completing an assignment to its full extent. But when it came to studying for exams, I always set a schedule about 1 to 2 weeks out. And before actually getting into serious prep, I would spend a few days reviewing the content thoroughly. So I made sure that I would understand everything. And then I would create practice questions based on the material. I would be in a group of friends who would all make practice questions too. So after we were all done, we just switch practice questions and do each other's. So not only did this serve as great practice, but we got to think from the perspective of the professor and how they would choose to create questions. After that, I would just focus on some of my weak areas and I'd be perfectly ready for the exam. And this strategy worked for every exam that I wrote. So what university courses did I take for medical school? Well, depending on the medical school you want to apply to, there are different requirements. I personally chose to apply to the Ontario medical schools, so I mainly took my courses around that. I took a lot of my first year typical courses like biology, chemistry, psychology, and then in second year, I took biochemistry and organic chemistry as well as physics. All of these courses are generally required for medical school. Physics isn't, but we'll get into that in a little bit. The next question being, did I take physics and was it necessary for medical school? I did take physics, but if it's necessary for medical school, the question is whether you want to apply to the US or not. If you want to apply to the US, you have to take 2 semesters of physics, but if you don't, it's not necessary. A lot of people do say that they took physics to prep for the MCAT. Personally, I didn't think that was necessary because self-studying is sufficient. Physics is a difficult course and you don't want to risk your GPA for this course. How did I balance my extracurriculars, my studying, and my social life? I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that it's easy to do that and I was able to do it all the time, because at first I really struggled with this. In my first and second year, I really just worked on my GPA the most as well as my extracurriculars, and I didn't really make time for my social life. And looking back, I wish I took more time to prioritize my social life, because it would offer a great way for me to de-stress, because I was really stressed in those first 2 years. But after that, I began to relax a little bit and I began to focus a lot more on that balance, and I was able to achieve it simply by budgeting my time effectively, working when I needed to and relaxing when I needed to. This simple dissociation between working and relaxing really helped me, at least mentally, find a lot of peace. What was my GPA? Now, a lot of you guys are curious, a lot of you guys have asked a lot of questions about my GPA, and I have talked a little bit about this on our TikTok, but my GPA, according to the Ontario Medical School Application Service, which is the portal through which you apply to medical school, my GPA was a 3.97. This is different from the way your university calculates your GPA. So when I applied to medical schools, they saw a 3.97. And I say this because I want you guys to know about my application. I want to be transparent, but I don't want you guys to feel like a 3.97 is necessary to get into medical school. I've seen plenty of people with lower GPAs getting in, so don't stress too much. Just do the work that you can do and do the best you can. So the first question I have here is, what was my MCAT score? I scored a 517 total on my MCAT. The next question is, when did I take my MCAT? I took my MCAT at the end of August. My official first attempt was at the end of August. What was my MCAT experience like? So earlier on, I did say that my first official attempt was at the end of August, but I had originally booked my MCAT for the beginning of August. And when I say my MCAT experience wasn't ideal, it really wasn't. So when I originally took this date, I went to the center, I wrote the chemistry section, I was feeling great. And then I moved on to the cars section. And the cars section was terrible. Basically, I panicked a lot, I got really nervous, and ultimately I didn't finish the car section. And I knew this wasn't anything like my practice. In all of my other practice exams, I was able to finish cars. I did really well on the cars section, but for some reason the nerves got to me. So on that day, I made the decision to void that MCAT. And what this means is that the attempt basically counts as null. It's like I never wrote the MCAT and the score was not registered. I then rescheduled my MCAT for the end of August, and I took a few days to just relax to make sure that my nerves weren't as uneasy. I then just focused the rest of my practice on managing pressure and nerves during cars. I then wrote the MCAT at the end of August and my experience was very smooth. The next question I have here is, how do you do well on the car section of the MCAT? The car section is one of the most brutal sections, unfortunately, but it is the most important for Ontario med schools. But the way to fundamentally improve in cars is through reading comprehension. Make sure your reading comprehension gets better. And the way to do that is to, first of all, read more. Reading more can really just get you into the habit of analyzing your passages better and reading faster. Second, a lot of practice is important. That goes without saying. And finally, you want to make sure that your strategy for answering questions really draws on what the passage is about. So whenever you approach a question, ask yourself whether the answer you select is related to the passage at all. Because sometimes that is an easy way to avoid getting a wrong answer. Just ask yourself if it has anything to do with the passage. Does the passage back up this answer? And if your answer is no, that answer is wrong. If it's yes, go ahead and circle that answer because you're about to get that answer right. What resources did I use to prepare for my MCAT? So by far the most important thing you can get is the AAMC question packs. These are so important because these are exactly like the questions you'll see on the real MCAT. So it's a no-brainer to get this stuff. I also used UWorld and integrated that into my content review for practice. UWorld is basically a question bank that creates a bunch of MCAT questions for you, but they're a lot harder than what you would actually see. For my content review specifically, I use the Kaplan 7-book set. It's great, it goes into just enough detail, and it covers the high-yield topics and highlights them for you. For cars specifically, I use Jack Weston, which is free, and the Princeton Review Hyperlearning book, which you can find online. Finally, for memorization, I used Anki. It's a flashcard software and it's recommended by a lot of medical students to help you remember stuff related to the MCAT. How long did I study for the MCAT? I studied for a total of 3 months, but you can choose to study however long you want as long as you have a proper schedule. You can find multiple schedules in our videos. What was my study schedule? This is really important to have a proper study schedule. For the first 6 weeks, I dedicated this solely to content review, and I integrated some practice questions from UWorld into this content review to reinforce it. After I was done with content review, that's when I started doing more practice. I started taking practice exams every other week, and I also did a lot more practice from the AAMC question packs as well as UWorld. I also focused a lot more on Anki and memorizing the content, focusing on my weak areas as well. For the last 3-4 days, I did take a big break. I only did a little bit of review, a little bit of passive studying. This is really important because you don't want to work yourself to death before your MCAT. Those 3 to 4 days of extra studying are really not worth the extra stress. Which university courses helped me to prepare for the MCAT? For me, those courses were essentially those first-year life science courses and organic chemistry as well as biochemistry. Organic chemistry and biochemistry specifically because those were more advanced subjects and those courses were a great introduction into those subjects. A lot of people recommend physics for MCAT prep, but personally, I think that it's not worth it because the physics course goes into too much detail. For the MCAT, you really only need a simple understanding of the basic concepts of physics, so I wouldn't recommend taking a course just for physics, like I said before. The next part of my medical school journey that I'm going to talk about is Casper. For those of you who don't know what Casper is, it's a situational judgment test that presents you with a series of ethical scenarios, and you're given a certain amount of time to answer that ethical scenario. The first question I have here is, why did I prepare for Casper? It's an ethics exam. How do you prepare for an ethical exam? The reasons are because it's an exam that you need to get into medical school, and ideally you want to do your best to make sure that you're as competitive of an applicant as possible. Second, Casper is really competitive, especially here in Canada, because certain medical schools do use it as a competitive score. What did I score on Casper? So I scored a 4th quartile on both times I wrote the exam. 4th quartile means that I scored 75 to 100% higher than every other scorer that took the exam on the same day as me. So the next question I have here is, what resources did I use to do well on Casper? So for practice, I used websites like PrepMatch because they contain a bunch of questions and simulate the exact format that Casper uses. When it comes to figuring out how to answer these questions, I did a lot of research and watched a lot of videos, and I finally came up with multiple structures that I use to personally score a 4th quartile. I recently put these in the form of worksheets, and personally, these strategies are essential for scoring a 4th quartile. And if you want access to these worksheets, we've linked them in the description below. How long did I study for Casper? So fortunately, Casper isn't anything like the MCAT or anywhere near as intense. Ideally, you should study about 2 weeks out from the exam. If you want a specific schedule for that, we have a video right here. Now we're going to move on to probably one of the most important segments of this video, and that's my medical school application process. So the first question I have here is, how many times did I apply? So I applied a total of 2 times throughout my life to Canadian medical schools. The next question I have here is, where did I apply? I'm mainly focused on schools in Ontario, and more specifically, I applied to Queen's, Western, University of Toronto, Ottawa, McMaster, and Dalhousie. For those of you who aren't aware, Dalhousie University is not in Ontario, it's in Nova Scotia, and it's the only out-of-province school that I applied to. So what are some tips that I have for writing medical school essays? So these tips can really apply to any essays you're writing, whether they're for the US or they're for Canada. The first thing I would say is be concise. There's no need to beat around the bush. There's no need to be very elegant in the way you say things. Just get to the point, because reviewers have so many essays to go through. You don't want to be the one that's confusing or misleading at any point. Number 2, have a solid structure. This is really important because it allows for your reviewer to have an easy time going through your essay. Keep your structure simple. You can even go back to the basic essays we learned how to write in elementary school. Finally, mention key characteristics throughout your entire essays. For U of T, those include the clusters that they have on their website. And for Western, this is really just focused around the CanMeds framework. You can choose to incorporate CanMeds into U of T as well. CanMeds is a list of characteristics that medical schools look for in their applicants. They're very important to mention, and they're very important to draw life lessons from. So make sure you think about them in this way. So the next question I have here is, what were my extracurriculars? So I'll just list them to give you guys a little bit of insight into what I did. So first, I was a tutor at multiple different institutions, which I listed as multiple positions. I worked at a student-led startup company. I volunteered at a local hospital. I also volunteered at a local clinic. I co-founded my very own not-for-profit organization. One of my hobbies was strength and conditioning and going to the gym, so I included that. I've been playing a few instruments for almost my entire life, so I also included that. I was also a writer for a local newspaper at my university, so I included that as well. I also took on 2 research opportunities. And finally, I volunteered for a social advocacy organization called Health Made Simple. This is not an exhaustive list of everything I did. These are just the ones that stand out and I feel really contributed to my application. Naturally, the next question is, what was the most important activity in my application? I think all of them were amazing and very important, but the most important one was definitely Blankets for TO, which was the not-for-profit that I co-founded. Blankets for TO, or BTO for short, was centered around providing supplies for and advocating on the behalf of homeless individuals in Toronto. I think it was important because it showcased my leadership ability, which is very, very important for medical school, and how to advocate for a vulnerable population. And this social component is also what really intrigued the reviewers. Is research necessary for medical school? I'm sure this is a question that's on a lot of your minds, especially if you guys are panicking about getting a research position, but the honest truth is that it's not necessary. Research is simply great at demonstrating the scholar role, which is a CanMeds role, and this can easily be covered by tutoring or by a bunch of scholarly awards. So if you aren't able to get a research position, or if research simply doesn't interest you, that's okay, you have alternatives. How did I get involved in research? Well, when it comes to research, the best way to get a position would be through networking, through getting to know your professors, going to their office hours and talking to them, asking, how did I get involved in research? The best way to do this is simply to talk to your professors, to network, to go to events where research professors are talking about their work, so that you can get a chance to talk to them, show interest in their research, and eventually they may let you onto their team. You can even go on your university's website and potentially find opportunities that are posted by professors. Finally, you may be able to apply to external research programs. For example, here in Toronto, Sick Kids is a very popular destination. What are some tips I have for writing ABS entries? For those of you guys who don't know what ABS is, it stands for autobiographical sketch, and it's a list of 32 activities that you have to describe in 150 characters, and these are only relevant for Ontario medical schools. Use the CanMeds characteristics to guide your descriptions. Include some talking point about at least 2 to 3 CanMeds characteristics per activity. I'd also say focus on results and talk a lot about what you learned as opposed to just what you did. And finally, be concise. You only have a 150 character limit for each entry, so you don't want to waste any characters. Reach out to us if you want any help with your ABS. The next question I get a lot is, how do I choose the activities I get involved in? My answer is very simple. Choose the activities to do that you're passionate about. Don't just do activities for the sake of getting into medical school, because not only will you feel miserable while in the process, you won't actually get anything out of the activity beyond maybe just an entry that you can add for your ABS. For example, I was really passionate about advocating for vulnerable populations, which is why my application is so heavily based around that. But I also wasn't shying away from including a lot of my hobbies and interests. I even talked about playing video games and working out in my application. What is the best advice I received when applying? This is a great question. The best advice I received is not to worry about the actual activities I was doing, more to worry about how to describe the activity. So in essence, it's not about what you do, it's about how you talk about it in your application. And this was basically life-changing, because not only did this shift my mindset to write my application better, but it also helped me explore a lot more of my hobbies and passions. It made me not shy away from doing so. Shout out to my mentors, you know who you are. And now we move into interview season, and here are the questions I received. Number 1, when did I receive interviews? So when it comes to Ontario medical schools, we normally get interviews in the month of January, but if you're applying to out of province, sometimes those interviews come earlier. So for my most recent application cycle, I received my interview for Dalhousie in November. However, for the rest of the Ontario med schools, they come in January. How many interviews did I get? So in total, I got 6 interviews in my last application cycle, All 6 of the schools that I applied to, I got interviews for. How did I prepare for interviews? So when it comes to preparation, I mainly found a massive list of practice questions, and I found them through medical students, through just searching the web, and I wrote down my answers for every single question. I wrote them down because I originally just wanted to get a grasp on how I should answer these questions, and then I actually started verbally practicing them with friends, by recording myself, and with other medical students. I really focused on 3 things: content, the way in which I spoke, and just my energy levels. By focusing on these 3 things, I was able to really get a good grasp on how a good interview should go, and that's what inevitably led to my success. What was my interview experience like? So for the most part, I'd say that my interviews were pretty stressful, especially in my first application cycle. I remember going into every single interview feeling so nervous, I was so on edge, and then going out of the interview, I was overthinking everything. I was so self-critical, I was only pointing out my mistakes, and I really made a bigger deal of these mistakes than I should have, and I feel like it costed me a lot of time and stress. Going into my second application cycle, I took the pressure off of myself by treating the actual interviews like practice. And this actually really helped because I wasn't as stressed, I was even cracking jokes with my interviewers, I was being more like myself. And these interviews felt a lot more natural, and I didn't have that same level of overthinking as I did previously. What types of questions did they ask in my medical school interview? So when it came to my interviews, I was asked numerous different questions, and I'll give you guys exactly what they asked. So the first question was, sorry guys, I can't tell you what I was asked because of an NDA that I have for each medical school that I interviewed at, but the types of questions I was asked were pretty straightforward. I was asked ethical questions, personal questions, and policy-based questions. You can find examples of these questions literally anywhere on the internet. Now, the big moment when I finally found out I was accepted into medical school. The first question I got about this topic was, how did I deal with the waiting for my acceptances? The waiting game for medical school, I'll tell you guys, is absolutely insane. After my last interview, I remember not really thinking about medical school or the interviews or how they went. I was just focused on finals as well as just hanging out with my friends. But the week leading up to acceptance, that week was an absolute nightmare. I couldn't stop thinking about what the results were, what was gonna happen. My life was just so uncertain at that point. But luckily, I had my friends and family. They realized I was stressed and they talked to me. They reassured me that everything will be fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about how the last cycle went. I ended up getting waitlisted by every single medical school I applied to in the last cycle. So I was so afraid that it would happen again. So the next question I got was, what were my results? So I ended up getting accepted into 3 Ontario med schools. These included the University of Toronto, which I went on to accept. I also got into Western as well as McMaster. I got waitlisted by Dalhousie as well as Ottawa, and I ended up getting rejected by Queen's earlier on. What happened on the day I got accepted? So this story is pretty crazy. I was so nervous leading up to it. The day before at 11:59 p.m, my heart was thumping like crazy. I was so nervous. So what happened was I was on call with my friends. I ended the call and then I went to log in because the results were going to be released at 12 a.m. on the next day. I went to log in at 12 a.m. and it wasn't refreshing. It wasn't opening. So I was like, what's going on? I can't see anything. 5 minutes later, I called my friends because I didn't want them to be worried, and I told them, I'm like, the results just aren't coming up. And a lot of people on Reddit had been reporting the same thing, so I realized that the system was just down. 30 minutes in, my friends told me that Western had actually released their results on their own separate portal. My intention was to not check Western because I wanted to see everything else. So what happened was I was trying to fall asleep after that because I didn't want to check anything. Even though I knew Western was up, I didn't want to check it. And eventually, after like 5 hours, I fell asleep. 3 hours later, I woke up at like 9 a.m. I ran downstairs to check on my laptop, open up the OMSAS portal, and I saw that I got accepted into 3 medical schools. Here was my reaction. Oh my God. Oh my God, no way. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God, no way, man. Oh my. I just got acceptances into 3 Ontario med schools. My parents were so happy, my friends were overjoyed, they all threw me a party, and it was probably one of the best days of my life. Why did I choose U of T Med over the other schools I was accepted into? Well, first things first, U of T Med is the top choice of most med students because of the fact that their curriculum is amazing, their hospitals are amazing, and downtown Toronto is great. Who wouldn't want to live in downtown Toronto? It's amazing, it's so fun. But I also had the major incentive of one of my best friends being Nimit, who was attending U of T Med at the moment. So all of these reasons combined made me decide to choose U of T Med over the other schools of Western and McMaster. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between my first application cycle and my second one. How did I deal with being waitlisted in my first cycle? So I actually did apply twice. My first time I applied was in my third year, and I got waitlisted from 3 med schools, U of T, Queen's, and Ottawa. When I found out that I got waitlisted, I was obviously very upset. I immediately started thinking about what went wrong and what I could do to improve it, and I was definitely not in a great mental state. However, I did have the hope that I may eventually get accepted later down the line because I did get waitlisted, right? But eventually at the end of May, I received multiple emails saying that the class was full. So I mentally prepared myself for the next cycle, and using the support of my friends and family, I convinced myself that I didn't get into medical school for a reason. And maybe I just wasn't ready at the time. Maybe I needed to grow a little bit more as a person. And I felt that in my 4th year, I did grow a lot. And I eventually did get accepted this year. So I think that it was a blessing in disguise. Did I do anything to improve my application between the 2 cycles? All I really did was work on my autobiographical sketch and refine my essays even further. But I didn't really add anything new. So what went wrong and how did I improve upon it? When I look back on the cycle, I think that what went wrong was I just wasn't confident enough in my interview practice. I did everything right, I practiced a lot. Maybe I could have practiced more, but ultimately I just wasn't confident in myself. So moving into the actual successful cycle, I approached the interviews with a more positive mindset, a more optimistic mindset. Even if I didn't do well on one day, I didn't let that affect me on the next day. I kept pushing and I perfected my answers to the best I could. And that was what ultimately led to my success. Now to end off, I'm going to be answering a few questions about my future as a medical student. So what specialty am I interested in? Going into med school, I wanted to keep an open mind, so I don't have a specific specialty that I'm interested in. As a kid, I used to be really interested in neurosurgery. I used to be very fascinated by the brain, but I do want to keep an open mind. Are there any challenges I anticipate going into medical school? Well, from what I know about how things are graded in medical school, I know that the constant testing at U of T is something that's very stressful, so that is one challenge I anticipate. I also anticipate maybe having difficulties balancing my time between trying to explore different medical opportunities, studying, as well as my social life. But ultimately, I know that if I create a solid schedule and talk to my mentors about ways in which I can optimize the things that I'm doing, I'll be able to overcome these challenges and many more in the future. And this brings me to the end of the video, guys. I hope this helped you regardless of where you are in your life. If you're a high school student, if you're a pre-med in university, or you're someone that's not even interested in medicine at all. I hope this gave you a little bit of insight into what it's like to actually apply to medical school and what it's like to be accepted. Feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions at all about anything that I've mentioned in the video, and best of luck to you all future doctors.